Now, this session will discuss the challenges that mental diseases pose in terms of social, economic burden, public health, and better management of patients, as well as opportunities to develop new strategies for integration of neuroscience with psychiatry and possible novel approaches to develop new medicines based on better knowledge of the biological mechanisms of mental disease. To chair this session, I would like to invite Professor Pierre Magistretti, Professor of Neuroscience in the Brain-Mind Institute here at EPFL, as well, of course, as the Dean of Biological and Environmental Sciences and Engineering at KAUST in Saudi Arabia. Pierre, you're going to lead this session, aren't you? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session where we will address, I think, a really extremely important issue in terms of health and, in particular, mental health. And the issue is how can we translate and leverage the really absolutely extraordinary progress that has been made over the last 30 years in neuroscience, in understanding how the brain works. And of course, there is still a lot ahead to understand, but really, I've been in this field for over 30 years, and I'm just all the time absolutely amazed of how much has been accrued in terms of knowledge since the late 70s. And yet, what of this immense knowledge that has been accumulated, has it been translated to improve the quality of and care and diagnosis for psychiatric patients? And in a way also in neurological patients. I mean, there have been some progress, at least in certain diseases. And the question then is, how can we address this challenge? Because obviously there is a challenge. And I think one of the reasons, and I will give you an example of this challenge, is how we can integrate the neuroscience culture within the departments of psychiatry. Of course, psychiatric patients require a lot of attention, a lot of clinical involvement, and I think everyone should be extremely in admiration and support all the effort that the health professionals do to make the life of patients suffering from mental disorders on a daily basis. And this is an immense investment that needs a lot of time and care. But at the same time, that of course monopolizes the efforts and the energy of the physicians into the clinical aspects, which again is obviously very important. But maybe there is a way in which neuroscience can be introduced in these in psychiatric departments. And there are efforts worldwide, of course. Some here in Switzerland, in Lausanne in particular, with the Center for Psychiatric Neuroscience. But I'd like to provide an example of what has been done in Switzerland through what is called the National Centre for Competence in Research, NCCR Synapsy. And its logo, its motto is the synaptic basis of mental diseases. So the idea is to facilitate research and connection between basic scientists and clinicians. So just what are the NCCRs in a word? It's a very interesting initiative from the Swiss National Science Foundation. They launched what they call these NCCRs. And the main goal of the NCCRs is to promote scientific excellence in areas of major strategic importance for the future of Swiss research, economy, and society. So science must be good, but there also has to be an impact on society. And these NCCRs are connected to universities, EPFL, in this case, University of Geneva, University of Lausanne, and they are evaluated not only for the quality of their science, but also for the impact that they can have on society. And quite, I should say wisely, the Swiss National Science Foundation recognized that mental disorders are a societal problem to which possibly neuroscience and connecting neuroscience and psychiatry could provide an answer. And so of the several proposals, 8 were selected, and 1 is this NCCR. So the main aims, and that's why I present it in the context of this panel, in terms of challenges and opportunities, to establish a strong collaboration between basic neuroscientists and clinicians through well-integrated research projects based on clinical cohorts. And I would say the second point is to introduce a neuroscience culture in the departments of psychiatry with the aim of training promising young clinicians to promote the emergence of a new generation of psychiatrists motivated by an academic career. And the whole issue is there, because if the same person, the same clinician, can also connect with the basic neuroscience, then we might see some hope, possibly for treatment, but already, for example, for early diagnosis. You know, psychiatric disorders, diseases of the brain actually cause about 30% of the costs of health. And within those diseases of the brain, a vast majority is certainly of psychiatric nature. So these, not only the suffering of the patients, but of course, the lost days at work, the burden on the families. I mean, all this has to be addressed. And this is what the NCCR is trying to bring in terms of contribution to address this challenge. So it reunited about 30 groups from University of Geneva, Lausanne, Basel, the hospitals, of course. And the challenges, really, that this NCCR addressed, I think, illustrates the core of what we will be discussing today. In other words, usually there is a limited extent of neuroscience culture and activities within the psychiatry departments, and for good reasons initially, because, as I said, clinical care is of the utmost importance, but it can be connected to basic research. The neuroscientists are generally, vaguely interested in psychiatric diseases. They just maybe at the end of their grant, they say that what you're working on might be important for schizophrenia or autism, but it doesn't really go further. But when there are clinical cohorts, patients that have been studied, that are part of a clinical research project, then one can connect and try to find links between these clinical cohorts and some basic science. And so the general principle that I put to the discussion to Sophie in a moment and to Julio also is to see to present what has been done in this area and in Geneva and Lausanne. And the idea is to try to what we call phenotype, characterize patients in terms of of characteristics or particular features that can be well defined clinically through neuropsychology, through imaging, for example. And these features, for example, loss of pleasure, anhedonia in depressed patients, well, that's something that is an endophenotype of depression. So that kind of if you wish, feature can then modeled in a way in certain animal models. And of course, in animal models, one can go much more deeply into studying the circuits that are involved. And so going back and forth between very well characterized clinical cohorts that provide some insight into how to model some aspects of the disease in animal models and submit this to the analysis of neuroscientists, that is a way to connect not only clinicians and neuroscientists, but also to possibly better understand the nature of the diseases, the mechanisms. And I would say the first step now would be to be able to come up with early diagnosis. I think Andrea Pfeiffer this morning showed very nicely about Alzheimer's disease, the different stages, where for psychiatric disorders, we should actually do the same. When care is started, usually it's too late. Everybody agrees that cancer or cardiovascular disorders are better treated if diagnosed very early, or even in people who are at risk well, this should happen also in psychiatric disorders. And this is what I think should be the direction where research in psychiatry should go. And this is just an example which, you know, it's open for discussion. And I'm sure that Sophie and Julio will give other examples. But definitely the time has come to bring together neuroscience and psychiatry for devising ways of early diagnosis and eventually also better understand the mechanism and possibly find novel cures and novel ways to manage patients. So this was just by way of a brief introduction. And